Hello, everyone, and welcome to the series on non-interpretive skills in radiology. Our topic today is medical legal stuff, which I know nothing about, but thank goodness I have Luke on with me. And Luke, do you want to introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kadam. My name is Luke Wojdyla. I am a neuroradiology fellow at the University of California, San Diego, newly minted fellow.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And my name is Nadia Kedem. Luke, tell me how you got into this. This is so unique that people are interested in medical legal stuff. What got you interested in this topic?
I have to give credit to one of my attendees, Dr. James Chen. He's also my neuroradiology fellowship director, who has done a lot of expert witness work and gave some talks on that. And it all started with the conversation about first of all, what are radiologists missing? I think that's what originally got me interested in this work. And then also, what are they getting sued for? Because both of those questions are interrelated and really important to what we do on a day-to-day basis. And something that not a lot of people talk about, or maybe they feel unqualified to talk about, or sometimes they can't talk about it because of non-disclosure agreements. I really wanted to just delve more into it because there's just so much to talk about. And it's just not really talked about at conferences and in radiology circles too much.
Yeah, that's very true. I think it's a very uncomfortable topic and nobody ever wants to be named in a lawsuit. Now, in the ABR syllabus, they say that approximately 7% of radiologists are named in lawsuits every year. But being named doesn't mean that one gets prosecuted or so in court. What does that mean, being named?
So being named in a lawsuit means that an injury has happened to a patient and they have filed a claim against you. Now that all sounds very scary and it is very common. There are a lot of big numbers that are thrown around, but mostly around 50% of radiologists will probably get sued by the time they're in their 50s. But just because you're named, that doesn't mean necessarily that the lawsuit is going to go to trial or that you're going to be found liable. In fact, the vast majority of lawsuits are dismissed, usually by the patient themselves or their lawyers when they find out more information. But it could still be a very stressful experience, even just being named in a malpractice lawsuit.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you can get named just because you were the random radiologist who read a study and it's in the medical record, and the lawyer just asked everybody to be named just in case it's relevant later in the lawsuit. And it might not be in most cases.
That's correct. They name everybody that they can in the beginning and they drop people later on as the case progresses, but not just the radiologist, but the hospital system, the university, other specialties. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
How many radiologists are found liable annually?
Sure. 60% of cases, more like 65, get dropped. 30% go to settlement, meaning that the lawyers, the defendant and the opposition agree to some payment, usually financial payment. Sometimes it's an apology or a change in practice patterns, like a promise to do better. And only 10% actually can't find an agreement and go to trial. Of the 10% of lawsuits that go to trial, 1% result in favor of the plaintiff, meaning the defendant radiologist would lose that case. So 1% of cases of all lawsuits, the defendant radiologist may lose.
It might be different between academic centers and private practice, but do you need your own lawyer going into this, or how is that covered? And what's the cost for that?
Great question. And this is something that's covered on the ABR core exam and is covered in the ABR non-interpretive skills document, which is a really fantastic resource. But malpractice insurance provides you with your own lawyer. If you are at an academic center, you are generally more protected than if you're in a private practice. And I think this is an under-recognized benefit of being in a huge institution because there's this concept of the corporate veil or the corporate shield, where big institutions like universities can take on the risk and they'll make an agreement with the plaintiff or the patient that if you drop the physicians from the lawsuit, we will go for a settlement, basically. That has been really popular and is a protection. The same thing applies if you work at the VA. where if a bad outcome happens, the plaintiff is basically going against the federal government. And so radiologists are protected like that. In contrast, if you're in the private practice group, you are more reliant on your malpractice insurance to handle everything. And when it comes to the cost of a lawsuit, it all depends on the outcome. So if a lawsuit is dismissed, which is the most common result, that's going to cost $30,000, even if it's just dismissed, which seems like a lot to me. And that's just for court fees, paying your lawyer to respond to filing claim. When it comes to settlements, it's a little murky because some of these are not disclosed to the public. In fact, a lot of them have non-disclosure agreements where the amount paid isn't publicly known. But for the information that we do have, the average settlement for a malpractice suit in radiology is about $500,000. And if the case goes to trial and results in a judgment against the radiologist, the average payment is about $1 million. So double that of a settlement. So on average, it's cheaper to settle than to proceed to trial.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that is quite expensive. I wouldn't want to pay 500,000 or even more. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the insurance. So when I started my new job, somebody said I should make sure that I get confirmation that I have tail insurance. Can you explain a little bit more what this tail insurance means?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me back up. I'll start by talking about claims-made insurance. So claims-made insurance is insurance that covers you while you have a job. But if you leave that job and a claim is filed after your insurance expires because you left that job, you're no longer covered for that incident, even though that incident occurred while you were working at the original place. So if you have a claims-made insurance, you need to buy tail coverage for when you leave that job, which will cover you for usually a set number of years after you leave a job for any incident that occurred at the original job. Depending on your practice environment, the state you live in, you may need to buy more years of tail insurance than others. So, for example, you work in pediatrics, right?
I do.
Pediatrics can have a longer statute of limitations than compared to adults. And both of these vary depending on where you live. In California, the statute of limitations is 1 year. In other states, it may be 3 years. So that will influence, I think, or should influence how much tail insurance you buy. The other type of insurance is called occurrence-based insurance. And this is claims-made insurance and tail insurance built together into the same package, which obviously is a better scenario for any physician, though these are usually more expensive and not every job offers them. But yeah, tail insurance can be very extensive when you leave a job. I've heard quotes of up to $50,000 depending on the situation, which can be a surprising bill that you may not expect when you transition to a new job.
Well, thank you for explaining that. I always made sure to get a copy of that tail insurance so I have it when I need it. It's the cost of this whole medical legal business has often been blamed for overutilization of imaging studies and defensive medicine. Do you think that is true? Do you know whether in states where tort reform has been implemented, there's any change in medical practices because of that?
Defensive medicine, yeah, it's a huge problem. It originated in the 1970s when malpractice rates skyrocketed and took off. And it has this cyclical effect that over time, defensive medicine practices then become the standard of care as everyone starts to do that. And the margin of error becomes narrow, much more narrow when everyone is ordering all these images to catch the 1% of injuries or pathologies that are rare. With regard to tort reform, it's a really complex question, and I truly actually don't know what the right answer is. I think it's had mixed results in certain states. In Indiana, they have something interesting where in order for a malpractice claim to go forward, it has to be reviewed by a panel of independent physicians just to assess the merit of it. And I think that's been helpful in decreasing the burden. I don't want to say the word frivolous lawsuits, but lawsuits without merit. There's other states that have malpractice caps, meaning you can only sue, for example, $100,000 worth of damages. And I think that has made some changes with regards to how likely a team of lawyers will take on a case, because these plaintiff attorneys, they have to make a living and they want to guarantee that they're going to get a high payout. So they're going to take the cases that they're more likely to win and win big.
You mentioned that the conviction actually occurs in a very small number of cases. And maybe that has to do with this requirement that you have to establish negligence, I think, on the part of the physician to get them convicted. And is that the right word, even convicted? And all this legal language is so strange to me.
Yeah, I know. I think liability is probably the legal term. But yeah, to establish negligence, you'd have to demonstrate 4 elements. And the first one is duty. Duty means that basically you have a patient-physician relationship. So what does that mean in radiology? That basically means once you open a study in your PACS, you have established a therapeutic relationship with that patient and you are responsible for them. It can also mean when a patient enters the radiology department, that there's a patient-physician relationship with the radiologist, even if you've never met that patient or looked at their images. So if, for example, if they're with the radiology techs and there's an injury that occurs during the imaging process, let's say they slipped on a bed or a stool and get hurt, then the supervisory radiologist can actually be liable for that. The next element to establish negligence is breach of duty. Basically, this means that the radiologist has to uphold standard of care. And standard of care can be a murky concept to define, but it basically means the care that a reasonable physician would provide in a similar situation. But it's important that this is not the level of skill that an average radiologist would provide, because then that would mean that 50% of radiologists are operating below the standard of care if you're just looking average skill. So it's reasonable skill and worded that way to give some flexibility, and because not every error we make constitutes negligence. The third element is injury, meaning that the patient has to actually be hurt by what happened. If there is for example, a radiological miss that doesn't result in any injury of the patient's not going to be able to sue that radiologist or wouldn't win that case. And the last one is causality. So you have to make a claim or an argument that the miss resulted in the injury. So, for example, if I missed a large vessel occlusion on a CTA and the patient had a stroke, then there's a good argument that there was causality linked between those two things. But if I missed a rib fracture on a chest radiograph and then the next day the patient had a stroke, there's not a great causal link between those two things. So I probably wouldn't be found liable for that.
Thank you for those great explanations. I want to dig a little bit more into the standard of care, because it's something that I've always wondered about. I'm trying to be really nice to my colleagues and help them out with vacation time and always be professional, because I'm afraid if I ever have to be in a lawsuit and they're being called as witnesses to attest to what the standard of care is in my group, that they'll do that in a kind fashion. But is that even the case? Will they ask my colleagues to come and speak to the standard of care in my place of work? Or could it be somebody from a really preeminent institution that practices at a really high level that could come in and say, oh, this is below the standard of care?
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually it's both the defendant and the plaintiff will hire their own expert witnesses who are experts in their field. So there'll be other radiologists, probably neuroradiologists for you, and they will testify basically what their professional opinion is. And there are guidelines on how to be an ethical expert witness. And there's a great article by Richard Dujak who talks about this. He has a whole series in AJR about this, which I definitely recommend people read. if they're going to do any legal work, because there have been problems, not just in radiology, but across medical societies and specialties of expert witnesses deviating from accepted medical standards in how they're portraying their professional opinion. And it's resulted in consequences. For example, the American College of Radiology has suspended or expelled its members for their conduct in working as expert witnesses. So
Oh,
it's something
wow. Yeah.
to take seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know that. Rich Duzak used to work with me, so I know him really well. So thank you for highlighting that article series. That sounds very interesting. You have done some research yourself on what are some of the reasons why medical legal actions occur. Is it diagnostic errors, procedures, or communication deficiencies? What are the most common reasons for lawsuits?
Yeah, that's a great question. And by far, number one, it's diagnostic errors. It's things that we don't see. And the EBR guide talks about two different types of errors, and this is in the literature as well. One is perceptual errors, which is basically you didn't see the finding and you didn't report it. And that is by far the most common type of radiology error. And it's the most common thing that we get sued on. The other type of error is a interpretive error, which is when you see a finding, but you misinterpret it, you ascribe to it a different meaning. And that is something obviously that you could also get sued on, but a little less common. Communication errors, I think historically, and I hear this from some of my attendings, that this was thought to be a very common cause of malpractice maybe 20 years ago, but that has actually decreased quite a bit. And I think we can thank the EMR, digital communication, standardized systematic communication using assistants that have really helped decrease the amount of communication errors. And it's ingrained in our culture now to communicate the important findings and how important it is. I think Dr. Leonard Berlin talks a lot about communication failures, and the courts have actually decided that the communication of the report is just as important as the radiology report. There was this great case that Dr. Berlin talked about of this urologist who ordered a CT scan on a patient and skipped to the renal section in the findings and saw no abnormality and didn't look at anything else. In the colon section, there was a description of a mass that the urologist didn't read. The case went to trial, and actually the jury found the radiologist liable for not communicating the colon findings either to the patient or to the urologist directly. And they sued for millions of dollars, and they won for millions of dollars.
Yeah, that's pretty scary. In terms of communication, there was a great publication from the National Academies several years ago on improving diagnosis in healthcare. And they actually defined an error in that definition. It's inclusive of not letting the patient know of a diagnosis. So I think we need to think more about how we get results to patients. And that's why now we have legislation that allows patients to see their results in the chart, because they are important agents of their own health and making sure that everything goes well. The other thing I also discuss with our trainees when we read out in the reading room, sometimes I catch people making a finding and then thinking about it and dismissing it as an anatomic variant or something, but not putting that little thought in writing in the report. And I always tell them, if you see something, you should put it in the report and then put your rationale why you think it's irrelevant or it's relevant, because that can be the distinction between completely seemingly not having seen it at all versus having seen it and maybe misinterpreted it, which you said is usually a lesser issue. Would you agree with that kind of approach to findings?
Yeah, I think it is really important to report what, if anything, to communicate to people that you looked at it and that you're not sloppy, because in a lawsuit, they take a look at everything. If you have a typo in your report, they look at your social media posts, they look at you as not only as a radiologist, but as a human being, and they try to paint this character picture of you. And so it's really important to always be professional, always be neat. And that includes being thorough in your reports. So I think that is something that can definitely be helpful.
Oh my God, I have a lot of typos in my reports. I should probably proofread a little better. I think the voice dictation systems are getting better, but they sometimes still make mistakes. They put the wrong word in there and
Yeah.
I miss that. Do you know if we have any published rates of what is the average typo in a radiology report?
Oh gosh, I think it'd be too high for anyone to publish.
But
And
if
I
it
also
goes
know,
into your evaluation as a negligent radiology, that might be something we want to have in the literature.
I will say with regards to communication results, a lot of hospitals have well-defined policies for these critical findings. So if you have a new bleed, it's usually well-defined that you have to communicate this, or something that's very life-threatening is usually well documented. But it's really those other things that are more nebulous, that are less serious. So a pneumonia on chest radiograph or a mass in the kidney, like usually the hospital doesn't have a policy on those types of things. Those are the things that are actually put you at more risk if something gets lost to follow up and the physician, the referring provider doesn't see that and you didn't communicate to them, then you can be held liable for that. I am always more weary of those less urgent findings. And I just really want to make sure that the referring provider sees that for the patient's benefit and also for the medical legal benefit as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned that. I was part of an initiative with the ACR where we developed a measure set, like a quality measure set for payment programs, but it was targeting this exact idea of actionable incidental findings, so findings that are not related to the indication, but they can be important down the road. Like you just mentioned, some incidental nodule on a trauma patient. More and more institutions are coming up with communication policies and pathways now for tracking these incidental findings and making sure that any recommended follow-up gets completed. I'm not an interventional radiologist, but does that play a big role in the medical legal field, procedure complications?
Absolutely. On average, proceduralists get sued more than other medical specialties. And that's probably true for interventional radiology versus diagnostic radiology as well. Although the literature for interventional radiology is a little less robust than for diagnostic radiologists. They definitely do get sued though for procedural complications is probably the number one thing. Post-procedural complications is also very common. Not monitoring for a pneumothorax after a lung biopsy is something that they can get sued for, and that's common. And then also for failures of informed consent. It's really important to have a good informed consent process to be documented appropriately, and also just to give the patient some agency to make sure that they're involved in their care, because that is really hard to defend in court if you fail to, inform your patient and document appropriately. It becomes basically a he said, she said type thing. And that's never something that you want to find yourself in.
Yeah, speaking of that, what is your recommendation on curb consult? Like occasionally people come in with a disc in their hand. So I have this patient in clinic. They brought in this disc. Can you take a look at their prior study? How should we approach those situations?
That's a really tough question. And it's something that we've been dealing with for many years. I don't think we have a great answer to, because theoretically, the moment you open up a patient in your PACS, you are establishing duty to that patient. You're establishing a patient-physician relationship. And so it's one thing if another radiologist asks you to look at a study, let's say they're a generalist and they need a radiology opinion, and you give it to them. That's one type of curbside consult. And I think there's probably less risk associated with that. The other would be a curbside consult, for example, let's say outside imaging that doesn't have a report in your system from your referring provider. You can talk with them over the phone about your thoughts of it, and they could potentially document that conversation in the Epic Note or EMR without you being aware of it. And then if something bad happens, all the court can see is that documented conversation in the EMR. So in that situation, it's the best practice would be to formally read that study and put your own dedicated report. And many institutions have mechanisms in place for second read reimbursements now. So you can actually get paid for that work, even though it might be a little bit less. Other than that, the curbside consult it still exists as a medical legal risk that we should definitely be aware of.
The last question I have is the medical legal protection for communications one might have about a case. So let's say I'm named in a lawsuit. I obviously have communications with my lawyer, but what kind of information from the medical record or in our system does the plaintiff's lawyer have access to? What can they subpoena and use in a lawsuit, and what is protected?
I love this question. And I think not enough people know what is discoverable. Pretty much everything is discoverable in court. Nothing is really protected. Even conversations with your spouse, in some states is not protected. So
Mm.
the moment that a malpractice claim is filed, first thing you should do is talk to your lawyer and don't talk to anyone else about the details of the case because you don't want to implicate anyone else in this. In terms of what they can discover, they can subpoena phone records, text messages, social media posts. I see a lot of physicians on Facebook post about tough cases, and I just want to caution against doing that because that can be discovered. And you may say something informally online that you didn't mean, and it can be misconstrued in court. Metadata in our PAC system is discoverable. And there was a recent case where a neurosurgery resident was questioned because it was discovered that his account was used to look at PACs at an image at 4:33 in the morning. So they can know exactly when a study was opened, by whom, at which workstation. There's another case where radiologists' keystrokes were subpoenaed, basically. So they can tell how many seconds they spent on a CT scan. And one of their arguments was that the radiologist spent less than a second on the image with the finding. Of course, this is a CT scan with probably hundreds, maybe thousands of images, but to a jury that doesn't realize that can sound alarming that the radiologist is less than a second on a finding. So all of these things are discoverable. And there's one exception that's important that's listed in the ABR study guide, which is peer review. And peer review has long been protected from discovery as an effort for physicians to engage in quality improvement. You know, these meetings, usually medical decision making is critiqued, and courts and have wanted us to be able to do that sort of freely just to improve our own practices and our care. And so those are generally exempt from discovery, but there are exceptions, and these are being increasingly challenged in court. For example, in the state of New York, peer review protection pretty much no longer exists. It is state dependent. And I would recommend being familiar with your own state's peer review policy and make sure it aligns with the hospital peer review policy.
Oh, okay, that's important. Yeah, I just had a conversation yesterday because I'm our peer learning champion in our department. And they asked me what to do to make sure that any files we keep for peer learning are protected. And what I was told is just to put them in a folder that is labeled as peer review materials or confidential peer review materials. And just having that label will apply this protection to the file. So that's what we're doing right now. And I want to go back to the metadata impact. So the other thing that I always do, and maybe you confirmed that, but when I review an imaging study, I always have my pack set up so all the images are in one series and I scroll from the very first to the very last image, because that way in the metadata, it tags every image as having been viewed by me. Because my understanding was sometimes if you maybe have a hanging protocol and one of the series is not hung up and you miss it and you never looked at it and the finding happens to be on one of those images, then in court they can easily show that you never looked at it, let alone you looked at it a second, but you never looked at it. Is that true? Is that a consideration? Or, yeah.
I think that's amazing. And I started doing the same thing. And I realized like my most experienced and senior attendees do the same thing. I used to be very into hanging protocols and getting the right setup, but now I just go one series at a time from beginning to end. And I think that's not only good for patient care because it systematically ensures that you look at every image, but like you said, it also communicates to a court that you are thorough and that you look at every image for sure. Yeah, I totally agree with that methodology.
Okay. And so about the seconds per image, is there actually anything we should do to avoid that? We can't spend a lot of seconds on each image. That's just not feasible. But any word of wisdom from you?
I think the key in that is just explaining to the jury how reading a CT scan or an MRI or any cross-sectional imaging works, or even ultrasound. I feel like ultrasounds are getting longer and longer every day. And really that it's like watching a movie, right? And that sort of ties back to why we often choose to do a settlement rather than to go to trial, because trials can be unpredictable and jury decisions can be unpredictable. Even though when you settle, you admit to an extent that you're at fault. That's part of and you get reported to the National Practitioners Database. But that's, I think, a small price to pay for ensuring a speedy resolution and a resolution that you agree on.
Okay. I learned a lot from talking to you today, Luke. You are such a source of wisdom on this topic. It's really amazing. I'm glad that you got interested in this and that you're available and willing to share what you know. Is there anything else we haven't mentioned that we should include in the discussion today?
I think we touched on all the big things, that the lower hanging fruit that I think every radiologist should know, not only for their daily practice, but all the stuff is being tested on the core exam, which I think is good because we need to learn it. And we don't have a lot of teachers for it.
That's true. That's very valid.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun being here.
Luke. I appreciate you. Thank you very much.